Hi, today we're going to talk about Chapter 3, which is Decision Making in Value Issues and Private Law. Hopefully this overview will help you as you carefully read the textbook and look at all the supplemental materials provided for you for this chapter. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing we want to talk about is an ethical dilemma and what that is. And let me make this just a little bigger here. Okay. So an ethical dilemma is when you face a decision, a choice between two things, and neither is a good choice because both go against your ethics. So, for example, let's say you have to choose between saving one friend or saving five strangers, as in saving their life. So you're faced with a decision where you can either save the life of one of your friends or five strangers. That would be considered an ethical dilemma because you're loyal and you love your friend, but also you know that, you know, saving five people is probably better overall than only being able to save one person. And next example of an ethical dilemma, you see your friend's spouse kissing someone else. Do you tell your friend the truth even though it will break their heart? So here you have a dilemma between friendship, loyalty, telling the truth, and also hurting their feelings. And then finally, a friend invites you to invest in their business. For a $500 investment, they will guarantee you will receive $5,000. You think it is probably something illegal, but you would really like to have that money. So that is also an example of an ethical dilemma. So when we're choosing to figure out how to deal with these problems, how do we make those decisions? Do we think about the consequences? Do we think about what our duties are? Do we think about what our values are? And today we're going to talk about how different philosophers made that choice, made that decision. So the first is consequence theories, also known as teleological theories. So all of these that we're going to talk about today are all theories. So they are just ideas put forth by people who have thought a lot about ethics and morals. So not one is right and not one is wrong. They are just theories. So the consequence or teleological theories focus on the consequences of decisions. So these theorists say that what you need to do when you're faced with an ethical dilemma is to think about what are the consequences of your decision, and then to make the best choice, you would think about the choice that brings about the most good. The two most famous philosophers in this category are Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. And they propose this idea of utilitarianism. It's one of the most popular consequence-based philosophies. And so what it says is you want to choose the most good for the most people. So in our example, when you are faced with the decision of saving one friend or five strangers, utilitarianism would say you have to save the five strangers over your one friend. When you are thinking about this type of reasoning, consequence-oriented reasoning, you need to also consider what's called equal consideration of interest. So this means that all individuals are important. So you can't say, well, I'm more important than someone else, so I'm going to make the decision just to be happy myself. This type of thinking is often used when resources are scarce. So for example, if there's only one heart to transplant, who gets it? This is the kind of question that utilitarianism tries to answer. Now, criticism of utilitarianism is that it's often impossible to know all of the consequences of our actions. So how can we make the right decision when we don't always know what's going to happen? For more information, I suggest that you watch this video on utilitarianism. You will have the link in the PowerPoint. A second type of theory, so this is different. We had consequence-oriented theory. Now we have duty-oriented theory. So unlike consequence-oriented theory, duty-oriented theories, which are called deontological, they don't consider the consequences at all. Instead, they think about what is your required duty in a situation, what is right and what is wrong. Immanuel Kant is considered the father of this theory. He believed there are universal rules that must always be obeyed, and these are known as categorical imperatives. So in this theory, you do not consider your consequences. You consider the ethical principles involved in a situation. So for example, if lying is wrong, then it is always wrong. And in this type of theory, you think that it would be wrong to lie even if the lie would save an innocent person's life. Because in duty-oriented theory, you can only think about the actions. You don't think about the consequences. So in this case, if lying is wrong, it's always wrong, even if lying would save someone's life. In duty-oriented theories, people cannot be only a means to an end. So for it, basically what it means is that you can't use people. So you can't marry someone who's rich just because you want to be rich. You have to follow your duty. You have to follow principles of what's right and wrong. John Rawls added to this idea with the idea of contract theory, which demands that you consider the choice without knowing your place in the scenario. What this does is, let's say that you are selling a car and you know that the car has bad brakes. You would have to, according to John Rawls, tell whoever you're selling the car to that it has bad brakes, because you would imagine yourself in that scenario as someone who's buying the car, and what would you want that person to tell you? Would you want them to tell you the truth or not? So you always consider your place, you always consider your choice in the scenario without knowing your place. Another example is if we were going to start a new society, would we allow for slavery or not? Well, we don't know if we would be the ones who would be enslaved or not. So we would always choose no slavery. And John Rawls would say that's the correct choice. Critics argue that duty-oriented theories are too rigid for real life, especially the way Kant does it, where you say lying is never acceptable, even if a small white lie is going to save someone's life. Also, critics argue that never thinking about consequences can lead to horrible results. If you're only ever thinking about your duty or what's right and wrong, but you're never looking at what's happening, that is not a great idea either. Here is another video. This is a video about categorical imperative and Kant. So I suggest you watch that by clicking on the link in the PowerPoint. Now, a third way to go, a third area of ethics is what are called virtue ethics. This system of ethics focuses not on the actions of the individual, but on their values. So what are they thinking? What are they believing? And so if someone is good, then their actions will always be moral as well, according to virtue ethics. Some of the most popular philosophers in virtue ethics are Gandhi and Aristotle. And there are also more modern philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre. MacIntyre argued, for example, that when one enters into a profession, such as teaching or medicine, one is accepting the authority and standards of that profession. The ethical obligations for such a person are different than the average person. So becoming someone who works in healthcare, according to MacIntyre, means you need to have certain virtues and act in certain ways dependent on your profession. Codes of ethics are a really good way to understand what is expected of your profession, and we'll talk about codes of ethics later on as well. In virtue ethics, the act must be chosen for its own sake. So you do good because it's good, not to get praise or awards. So in virtue ethics, it wouldn't be considered like the right thing to do to volunteer in order to get an award, or to volunteer in order to get a prize at the end. Virtue ethics would say you volunteer because volunteering is a good thing for your community. A final theory is divine command theory. And this is the idea that our ethics, or what is right and wrong, come from some sort of divine being like God. So the idea here is that there is a God or some other supreme being that gives us a set of rules. So example might be the 10 Commandments in Christianity, or rules in the Quran or in the Torah. And then as people, we are just required to follow those rules. There are also examples of non-divine figures like Buddha, who gives rules for living that are not necessarily related to religion. Criticism of divine mandate theory is one, it assumes a belief in a divine being. So if people or a community do not have a belief in a divine being, then they aren't going to be able to take part in this. And it also does not cover all the complexities of life. For example, the Ten Commandments, cover certain things, but they are not maybe able to cover every question that someone would have about what they should do. And then finally, a criticism of divine mandate theory is that is an action good just because God says it's good? Or does an action have inherent good or bad qualities? Or is God the only one that can judge that? So these are all different theories: divine mandate theory, virtue theory, duty-oriented theory, and consequence-oriented theory. They're all theories for how people should act so as to be moral or ethical or good people. There is no right or wrong. These are just different ideas for how to act. Okay, the last part of this chapter deals with private law. And private law is when you have conflicts between citizens or between organizations. So we are going to think about, if a patient is suing their doctor or the hospital or some other healthcare provider. A tort is a private wrong or injury. So when you're dealing with disputes between patients and caregivers, those are torts. And you have negligent torts, intentional torts, and strict liability. Negligent torts are when you kind of accidentally did something wrong. Intentional torts is when you did something wrong on purpose. And strict liability is when there's been a claim against a defective product. So maybe a medicine was defective or a medical device was defective. Then there are different types of negligence to know about. Malfeasance is an unlawful or improper act. So if if a healthcare provider disclosed information about a patient to a third party, that would be malfeasance, would be an unlawful or improper act. Misfeasance is improper performance of an act that leads to injury. So if a healthcare provider, for example, maybe gave the wrong medicine to a person, and that led to their injury. And then nonfeasance is the failure to perform an act. So maybe if someone came in and needed assistance right away and the healthcare providers did not provide assistance. And then to prove evidence of negligence, there have to be 4 things. They're called the 4 Ds. So duty, there must be a provider-patient relationship. So, in order for there to be negligence, there has to be an already established relationship between the patient and the provider. Dereliction of duty, which means that the provider did not act as a ordinary competent provider would have acted. So they didn't do what they're supposed to do, basically. Direct cause is that whatever they didn't do was a direct cause of the damage. And then damage, there has to be injury. There must be an injury to determine negligence. There's a typo there, but there must be an injury to determine negligence. Otherwise, if there's no injury, there's no damage, then that would mean that there was not any negligence. Okay, hopefully this mini lecture will help you as you read and understand chapter 3. Please let me know if you have any questions.